Bruce Gagnon, coordinator of the global network against weapons and nuclear power in space. Welcome to Enviro Close-Up. I am Carl Grossman with Bruce Gagnon, and he is the coordinator of the leading group internationally trying to keep space for peace. Welcome, Bruce.
Thank you, Carl.
Now, how did you get involved, Bruce, in space issues and, well, was central in the formation of the global network?
Well, in 1982, June 12th, I remember the date very clearly. In New York City, there was almost 1 million people protesting against nuclear weapons at the special session on disarmament. I was at home in Orlando, Florida, watching the rally, the speakers, the march on C-SPAN. And after it was all over, they switched to a right-wing conference, and the speaker at that conference was Ronald Reagan's head of SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative. His name was Lieutenant General Daniel Graham. And in the Q&A after his speech, somebody raised their hand and said, General Graham, aren't you worried about that protest in New York today? They say there's almost 1 million people there protesting against nuclear weapons. He said, no, I think it's fantastic. They're protesting against nuclear weapons and we're moving into space. They don't have a clue. Let them keep doing what they're doing. And so it was literally in that moment that I said, I've got to get onto this. And the next year I went to work for the Florida Coalition for Peace and Justice. And it wasn't too long after that, you and I met, and we've been working together for many, many years.
Indeed, I've done a good number of TV programs, Enviro Close-Up programs, and have written books about what's going on and what's going on now with the U.S. Space Force, initiated by Donald Trump, but now being pushed ahead by his successor, Joe Biden. The situation today, particularly in the context of how you got into it all, the situation today, Bruce?
Well, in a way, it hasn't really changed a hell of a lot, to be honest with you. There's more money involved now. The technology has obviously matured since 1982, but we still see the consistent effort to project this notion of American exceptionalism that U.S. will control space and dominate space and deny other countries access to space, words that were in the Space Command's pamphlet called Vision for 2020 that was published in 1997. And in fact, at the Space Command headquarters in Colorado, above the doorway, their logo reads Master of Space. And so that has really continued on. And when you think about it, that planning document, Vision for 2020, was really right on schedule, because last year, when Trump was president in 2020, they came forward and created this Space Force, the new branch of the military. And remember that the Democrats controlled the House of Representatives at that time, as they do today. And they could have stopped Space Force dead in its tracks. But the only thing the Democrats actually asked for was to call it the Space Corps, like the Marine Corps. And they didn't really even fight for that. So what we see consistently since the time of Reagan to today is both parties committed to this idea of US control and domination of space, and that US will use space technology to fight all of its wars, no matter whether you're a troop on the ground, in a tank, on a ship or an airplane. Everything the military does today is coordinated by space technology, space satellites, and the downlink stations that they talk to that have been built by the US all over the world. And in our early days, as you well know, because you've been on many of these trips, we've gone to these countries where the US has these downlink installations. And there are local people who've organized peace groups to oppose them, saying, we don't want our country to be used as part of the US Star Wars program. And so these people became the membership, the bedrock of the global network through all these years.
Now, the Outer Space Treaty of 1967 was put together by the United States, the former Soviet Union, the United Kingdom. It really sets aside space for peace. I mean, it's the theme of the global network, to keep space for peace. It's not adhered to, it's not believed. I mean, how do you see the Outer Space Treaty, this visionary treaty that would keep war out of space? How do you see it being treated these days?
It's being trashed, as the Moon Treaty is as well, both of them by the UN. And I really must congratulate the UN in the sense that they really were very forward thinking. Let's think back to the days of Christopher Columbus, the European powers sending out their explorers into the New World to find new markets, new resources, new colonies. And that created the global war system. As soon all the European powers were cutting each other's throat, trying to get out there and control this new world. Well, the UN looked ahead and said, we can't allow that bad seed of war and greed and domination to be carried into the heavens. So let's preempt that with the Outer Space Treaty, the Moon Treaty. The Outer Space Treaty said that all of the planetary bodies would be the province of all humankind. And no country, no individual, no corporation could claim ownership of those planetary bodies. Really, really solid stuff. But in 2015, Barack Obama signed a new law giving rich fat cats and American corporations the right to go out and make land claims on the planetary bodies, basically torpedoing the Outer Space Treaty. And now the US is moving towards setting up military bases on the moon, torpedoing the Moon Treaty as well. So clearly, the United States sees itself as, again, the master of space, which I think is provocative, dangerous, extremely destabilizing, and something we all should be very, very worried about. And one last thing on this. Many years ago in various industry publications, they were bragging that this whole Star Wars program would in the end be the largest industrial project in the history of the planet Earth. I call it pyramids to the heavens. And they said it'll be so expensive that they must come up with a dedicated funding source to pay for it. And then one time I read in one of the industry publications called Space News an editorial saying, we've done it. We've come up with a dedicated funding source. We're now sending our lobbyists to Washington to secure it. And they said it's the entitlement programs that in America officially are Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and what's left of the social safety net, which is in tatters today. These are the programs that the aerospace industry have targeted for defunding in order to pay for all of their master of space plans.
Now, Bruce, I'd say most people watching this program now haven't really known about this from media, from mainstream media, so-called. I mean, stories about the U.S. trying to turn the heavens into a war zone with this Space Force and saying, forget about the Outer Space Treaty and so forth. I mean, you don't see stories about that in the New York Times. You don't see stories about that in the Washington Post, which is incidentally now owned by Bezos, who's sort of involved, has in not only in owning the Washington Post and Amazon and U.S. space activities. Why do you think there's been this, well, would you call it a cover-up of these efforts to weaponize space?
Absolutely. And I think we know the answer to that question. Over the years, there has been so much money directed into the military industrial complex since the Reagan years, a lot of it for these space plans, but for other things as well, that they've made so much excess profit that many of these weapons corporations and their allies in the corporate world have bought up much of the media, consolidated the media so that these stories are no longer talked about. Just recently, you and I were reminiscing a bit about our early days of working together in the late 80s, at the time that NASA launched Galileo and Ulysses, plutonium missions to space that we worked together to oppose. And then in 1997, Cassini. And during those days, we would spend in an evening 3 or 4 hours doing interviews on the media, doing radio talk shows all over the country, getting huge amount of media. I remember one time getting a phone call during the Cassini campaign. A waitress in Detroit said she was at work, and you know how there's always a newspaper sitting on the lunch counter. And she said during a break, she picked it up and she saw an article about Cassini and the plutonium, and she was outraged and wanted to help. And she tracked us down and called and said, what can I do to help? Well, that doesn't happen anymore because of this corporate media domination. All we're left with now is some alternative media. I urge people to go to our website, which is spaceforpeace.org, spaceforpeace.org, and go and look at some of our videos. We now have one of our board members, an Iraq and Afghanistan war veteran, who makes a monthly space video for us about various different parts of this space issue so that we can reach the public with these. But it's not like being on the news. When we opposed Cassini in 1997, 60 Minutes covered our opposition to that launch. Well, that would never happen today because of this corporate domination of the media. And you can't have real democracy, because real democracy means an informed citizenry. You can't have real democracy when you have corporate consolidation of the media.
Well, as a professor of journalism, I must say this non-coverage of the weaponization of space and nuclearization of space, these issues are tied together, is a real breakdown of the American press system, which could lead to enormous tragedy. I mean, if indeed the heavens become a war zone and war breaks out in the heavens, I mean, the consequences to us below, apocalyptic, really.
Well, let me jump in there, because that brings something to thought. In 1989, during one of our campaigns against the NASA plutonium launch, we had a rally at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, and our keynote speaker that day was Apollo astronaut Edgar Mitchell, one of the moonwalkers. And he came and said, if there is one war in space, it'll be the one and the only. He said, because we will create so much space debris or space junk from all the destroyed satellites and things like that in space, that there would literally be a minefield encircling the planet, or he called it a piranha-laced river that we would not be able to get through. A rocket would not be able to get off this Earth through that minefield. And he said, so it's insane to think about having a war in space. And so these guys know this at the Space Command. We went one time, had a tour of one of the Space Command buildings at Peterson Air Force Base in Colorado, and they showed us these big screens where they were tracking all the space debris, because now and then they have to move satellites or the International Space Station out of the way because of the space debris. And so if there ever is a cascading effect where things start crashing into each other and being smashed up, guess what happens here on Earth? It goes dark. Because why? Because ATM machines, internet banking, cable TV, air traffic control at the airports, traffic lights in the cities, you name it, cell phones, everything is hooked up to military satellites. And when they're smashing into each other, everything on the Earth shuts down and we literally go dark.
The connection between, as your name points to, weapons and nuclear power in space. Can you speak about that connection, Bruce?
Well, at this very moment, NASA has put out a request for proposals to begin testing the nuclear reactor for a nuclear rocket powered with a nuclear reactor to go to Mars. And they want to test it just over our head in what's called lower Earth orbit. They want to send them up there and test them to find out whether they work. Well, oh, that sounds great, right? Far away, but what if something goes wrong? What if these nuclear reactors don't work properly, fall back to Earth, burn up on reentry, spread a deadly toxin across the planet? You and I both know there's been these kind of accidents over the years by both the United States, the former Soviet Union, and Russia today. We've all three of those countries have had accidents with nuclear devices over the years. And there have been consequences, ecological, environmental, health consequences as a result. And so the nuclear industry views space as a new market. They want to have nuclear powered mining colonies on the moon and Mars and asteroids. And like I said, they want to have a nuclear rocket to Mars, cutting in half the amount of time it takes to get there. So it's just a series of scandals, really, that again are not being reported in the mainstream media, other than to cheer them on and to say, hey, this is wonderful.
And before 1992, when the global network was formed, we're talking now about the 1980s, Ronald Reagan's Star Wars program was based. This was not reported, Frank, I don't recall it being reported, highlighted at all, that it was predicated on orbiting battle platforms when that was reported. And they'd be on these orbiting battle platforms, hypervelocity guns and particle beams and laser weapons, but not reported that they were, these high energy weapons would be powered by nuclear reactors or super plutonium systems on these battle platforms. In fact, General James Abramson, he was the commander of the Strategic Defense Initiative, Star Wars. He said at that point that without reactors in orbit, we're going to have a long extension cord down to Earth, bringing up power to power these weapons. And what's going on now in terms of nuclear in space? Well, in the governmental U.S. governmental documents, they speak about a synergy between the military and the civilian space agency, supposedly civilian space agency, NASA, in terms of space activities. If I can just touch on your background, Bruce, I think people would be interested. You're an organizer. You're frankly the finest organizer I've ever known in my life. How did you get involved, Bruce, becoming an organizer?
Well, before I answer that question, but thank you for the compliment, I want to just wrap up the nuclear reactor stuff. When they are building fabricating these nuclear devices for space, they do them at the Department of Energy laboratories, places like Los Alamos, Savannah River Plant, and a host of others around the country. Guess what? they have accidents. They have worker contamination. They have releases of radioactive materials into the air, into the water. So it's not some theoretical thing that there might be an accident upon launch or something like that. They're killing us literally even before they go to launch. So that's something we need to remember. Now, to answer your question, I grew up in an Air Force family. I was bred in military schools on US bases, reading a series of books called We Were There series. We were there at the Alamo, at the Battle of the Bulge. I was a young patriot. In 1968, we were living at Eglin Air Force Base in Northwest Florida. And I was 16 years old working on the Nixon campaign. He was running for president. And I did such a good job, they said, that when they had a big fish fry right before the election, they invited me to sit at the head table with their guest speaker that evening. Some of you might recall the name of Senator Strom Thurmond from South Carolina. So that was how I was honored for my hard work. And then in 1971, during the Vietnam War, I tried to join the Air Force, but I flunked my induction physical because of an old high school football injury. So I had to get a waiver to get into the military. I wanted to be a career man, just like my dad. When everybody else was trying to get waivers to stay out of the military because of the war in Vietnam. But I was sent after my training to a base in California, Travis Air Force Base. It was an airlift base for the war in Vietnam. And when I checked into the barracks the first day, they looked down this clipboard and the guy says, "Oh my God, I'm sorry, man. We've only got one room left. We'll get you out of there as soon as possible." And as it turned out, we walked in the room and there were anti-war posters all over the wall. As it was, this guy was one of the organizers in the GI resistance movement. So at night, there would be meetings in my room. Some nights, white guys talking about the war. Other nights, black guys talking about racism in the cities. They were Black Panthers, racism in the military. And I got the education of my life. And after a while, I was a good-hearted person. I was always a curious person. I was just ignorant because I grew up behind the military base gates. So that experience changed my life and turned me into a peace activist. And once I was out of the Air Force, going to college, I got recruited by the United Farm Workers Union, Cesar Chavez's union, to organize fruit pickers in Florida. And they trained me as an organizer. And much of what I do today, I have to give credit to the United Farm Workers Union.
Wow. Could you describe the kinds of things that the global network is involved in and how people, viewers of the program, could get involved with the global network? Because, I mean, if the Democrats and the Republicans in the United States are in bed on this, it'll take grassroots action to turn things around.
Well, we publish a newspaper called Space Alert. We publish it twice a year. Just today, I received it from the printer. It'll soon be in the mail to our members. I urge people to contact us, and I'd be happy to send you a copy. And you can find our contact information at our website, spaceforpeace.org. We do a lot of internet organizing, as everybody does these days under COVID. We're fast approaching our annual Keep Space for Peace Week, which is October 2nd through 9th. And during that week, we ask local people around the world to do various things to help illuminate this issue out there. People could write a letter to the editor and say they don't want their tax dollars to be wasted on an arms race in space. That would be very helpful. So there are many, many things that people can do. I also do a blog where I post every day. It's called Organizing Notes. You could take a look at that. It's kind of my diary, my organizing life's diary that I do. So that and a lot more.
One of these days, the big claim by a lot of politicians and in the people in the military in this Space Force and Space Command, they say, well, we got to move up there with the Space Force and with, well, ultimately it'll be weapons in space. It'll be Star Wars again because of China and Russia. But on the other hand, China and Russia have been trying for decades to expand the Outer Space Treaty, which prohibits weapons of mass destruction in space, with what's called the Paros Treaty, Prevention of an Arms Race in Outer Space Treaty. And the U.S. has blocked action on that at the UN. How do you see the arguments of these space war promoters blaming everything on China and Russia in that light?
Well, I'll tell you a quick story. I read a book about Crazy Horse, and after he was brought onto the reservation in the late 1800s in South Dakota, the Indian Wars pretty much dried up. And just before that, the Civil War, of course, was over. And so the then military industrial complex was out of money. I mean, they were in trouble. And so what they did was they had somebody write a phony story saying Crazy Horse was back on the warpath. And this ran in all the major papers across the country. And soon the Congress appropriated more money for the Indian Wars. In fact, Crazy Horse was sitting in his teepee without a horse or a gun. So the United States, as its way of trying to stay as the master of space and control of the planet on behalf of corporate capitalism, they overestimate the enemy's capabilities in order to scare the people, in order to get the people to appropriate, to support appropriating more money for these endless wars. Getting back to what you said about the treaties at the UN, the Paros Treaty, it's the idea of it is to close the door to the barn before the horse gets out. Clearly, the United States has no intention whatsoever of ever agreeing to any kind of treaty to limit weapons in space unless the American people force Washington to do it. And if you keep it out of the media, as Noam Chomsky has said, how can you expect the American people to react to anything if they don't know anything about it?
Well, let me just note the first conversation I ever had with Bruce Gagnon. He was with the Florida Coalition for Peace and Justice. And I was writing about I had broken the story about the Challenger. Its next mission involved lofting a plutonium-fueled space probe. And Bruce called me up here in New York and said that in Florida, we're at ground zero. I mean, they're launching these nuclear payloads, plutonium considered the most radioactive, the most dangerous radioactive substance of them all. And we have to do a lot about this. And Bruce, you've devoted your life to try to do something about this, and I must congratulate you fully, Bruce.
Well, thank you, Carl.
Because it's not just Florida at ground zero. We're all at ground zero with this this push to nuclearize and weaponize space. Bruce, thanks for your work and thanks for being with us on Enviro Close-Up.
Well, thank you, Carl.
I'm Carl Grossman. You've been watching Enviro Close-Up. Check out our website, envirovideo.com, to view our programs, including a good number on the nuclearization and weaponization of space.